Program Director, Your Excellency President Samia Suluhu Hassan, Your Excellency President Dr. Hussein Ali Mwinyi, distinguished participants, comrades, ladies and gentlemen. I must thank the Mkapa Foundation for giving me the opportunity to participate in this symposium and apologize that I couldn't come in person. But I'm very, very glad to have this opportunity to salute a great leader, a principled leader of Africa, of Tanzania and of Africa, and a very principled Pan-Africanist. And in that Pan-Africanist context, I must mention the Democratic Republic of Congo. I mention it because you remember that the Kabila forces, Laurent Kabila, marched into Kinshasa in 1997, and with Mobutu having left. That for all of us, for Mkapa, for all of us, that signified an important change in what we thought all of us was a very important country. I'm mentioning because one of the things that President Mkapa did quite correctly was to say that with the change having taken place, let's do whatever we can in order to make sure that the Congo recovers from all of these years of Mobutu. And indeed, he sent units of the TPDF, took it to the Congo to help to retrain the Congolese army. They're very, very important intervention as part of that process of the rebuilding of the DRC. Unfortunately, that was 97. Unfortunately, in 1998, you remember that a war broke out there between what was called an African war. Because on one side, you had 4 African countries, Congo, Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and on the other, you had Rwanda and Uganda. And a decision was taken, President Mkapa and others, that it's better that to pull out those TPDF units, and asked us to help them to evacuate those forces back to Tanzania, which then South African Air Force did. It was an important decision not to participate in the war, because what was important was to find peace and then to negotiate and solve whatever the problems were. And indeed, I was very, very happy to see that later, SADC asked Mkapa, President Chiluba, President Chisano, to work on the Congo, to help it really to overcome its problems. It is out of that grew the Inter-Congolese dialogue, led by President Masire, and we're very, very happy indeed to support President Masire in that process, which then led to the agreement opening the way to the democratic elections in 2006. I'm mentioning all of that to indicate the place of Mkapa as a Pan-Africanist. A Pan-Africanist dealing with this very, very important African country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And of course, I can mention other instances. It was not only then that he was involved with the DRC. Even in 2008, the African Union sent him as its special envoy on the Great Lakes region, and he teamed up with President Obasanjo again to engage the Congolese to help them to solve their problems. He got other interventions. For instance, you remember that he had to intervene in Kenya after the 2007 elections, intervened in Sudan, in South Sudan, in that referendum of 2011, and we cooperated on that because I was working on Sudan on behalf of the African Union, and he came there as a representative of the UN. We've cooperated like this, worked together like this, by President Mkapa on these Pan-African things, these challenges. I remember also beyond that, in 1996, Tanzania had a terrible tragedy of the sinking of the ferry on Lake Victoria, the Bukoba ferry, and President Mkapa asked us to send divers to help in the rescue of the people who were, or recovery of the bodies. And indeed, the South African Navy sent divers who joined Tanzanian divers, Kenyan divers, and between them they managed to rescue at least 300 bodies out of the 500 or so that drowned when that ferry drowned. That intervention emphasized the need for us formally to strengthen the relations between ourselves and Tanzania, an old friend of our struggle. It's one of the reasons that, for instance, in 2005, President Mkapa and myself signed an agreement to constitute a Presidential Economic Cooperation Commission. That commission was intended to make sure that we do everything we can in order to help in the development of Tanzania. When it was right at the end of President Mkapa's second term as president, so we had to activate that important commission when President Kikwete took over. And for instance, in one of its sessions, it had to discuss progress with regard to the special development initiatives, which were the Mtwara Development Corridor and the Central Development Corridor. Those two corridors, to develop them, discuss a memorandum of understanding on trade and investment, in agriculture and food and security issues, customs and revenue issues, migration, transport and communications, and issues relating to minerals and energy. I'm citing that to say that this was a vision that Ben Mkapa had, that we needed to have this joint commission as these two countries in order to cover areas like the areas that I'm mentioning. I should have said earlier that one of the things that helped in that process of really spurring us on in terms of that bilateral was the fact that after the South African Navy divers had worked on that rescue in Lake Victoria, it strengthened the relations between the South African National Defence Force and the TPDF. And indeed, it was exactly that. It became possible for the South African National Defence Force even to patrol off the coast of Tanzania as we combated piracy. But we were very, very inspired indeed when I saw the attention that President Mkapa was paying to the matter of the bilateral relations between South Africa and Tanzania. And he was more than a Pan-Africanist. Ben Mkapa was also an important leader of the countries of the South. It was for that reason that for 12 years he served as the chair of the board of the South Center. You remember the South Center set up by Mwalimu, and Mwalimu had occupied that position of chairing the board of the South Center for some time, succeeded by President Mkapa. Then in 2018, President Mkapa came to me and he said, well, he virtually instructed me. He said, look, I've served my terms as chair of the board of the South Center, a very, very important think tank, for the countries of the South, particularly as they negotiate with the countries of the North. And so he really virtually instructed me to say, you have to take over, succeed me, Ben Mkapa, as you chair. I had to do that. I agreed with him. And it was a challenge. I knew it was going to be a challenging thing to follow in his footsteps. Because, for instance, when it paid homage to him, the South Center says that it pays homage to his indefatigable work to fight poverty and entrench civil rights, and called him a true statesman and leader of the South, and that he leaves behind a stellar legacy. That's part of what they said when President Mkapa passed away. So I followed him with regard to that. And indeed, my direct experience of that work with the South Center now is exactly that he has left a stellar legacy in terms of the leadership of the countries of the South. So I'm saying not only an outstanding Pan-Africanist, but a leader of the South really who's made a very, very important contribution. President Mkapa delivered the Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture in 2011. We asked him to do this, and indeed he very willingly came. I want to read something of what he said in that lecture. He said that, for instance, he is asked as a president by people who say, would your citizens miss the summits of such organizations as the African Union and SADC and so on? And he said, this is a shortcoming, this thing about summits which don't make an impact on the minds of the Africans. He said, this is a shortcoming of both the regional and continental organizations. The number and momentum is slowing down. The summits have descended into annual parades. Implementation of past decisions is inadequately reviewed. New development initiatives are not sufficiently backed by funding, and so become simple resolutions of hope. Our actions do not match the ambitions we proclaim. Churning out position papers will not fight poverty, illiteracy, and disease. Analysis of our problems must happen concurrently with deliberate capacity building to address them. I consider these three freedoms, freedom from food security, from ignorance and from disease, as a fundamental and priority measure of the dignity of African independence. More emphasis should be given to the war against them. The terrain to fight them must be of our own demarcation. The weapons and terms of their deployment must be of our own determination. The indices of success must be established by us, and external support groups, whether civil or state, must be selected by us. Their deployment too must be monitored by us. The war is fundamentally our own, and we can win if we set our sights objectively. I'm a poor student of my country's founding father, Mwalimu Julius K. Nyerere, and my remarks today may sound pessimistic. So let me end with an optimistic thought. On 16 October 1997, Mwalimu addressed the South African Parliament and concluded his remarks thus, and I quote, "I'm saying that Africa is changing because the leadership in Africa is changing. Africa is beginning to realize, and we should all encourage Africa to get that realization more and more, that we have to depend upon ourselves, both at national level and at the collective level. Each of our countries will have to rely upon its own human resources and natural material resources for development. But that is not enough. The next area to look at is our collectivity, our working together. We all enhance our capacity to develop if we work together." And I really do believe that this message from Mwalimu, which is also Ben Mkapa's message, is a message, is an instruction he left to all of us, that we work together, we develop. That is the strength of his Pan-Africanism. Thank you very much.